From the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina, this is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, presented by A Cloud Guru, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we're going to set a record here, I think, Brian. This is, 3 shows in a row? It's just you and I?
That's right. Yeah, I was thinking maybe we should have we should set the line, what's the over-under on the number of shows you'll do in a row here? Should we set it at 4, or should we set it 3.5 right now? Or
well, this is the first podcast for 2018 for the new year. So why don't we just go ahead and call this my New Year's resolution is to be on the podcast more? How's that?
All right, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. How did you survive the end of 2017?
Actually, it was pretty mild comparatively. I guess, we're getting old here. There isn't a lot of partying going on in this house anymore. It's just the way it tends to be these days, and I'm perfectly fine with that. How about you?
Yeah, mine was good. I spent the last week doing nothing but changing light bulbs, putting new batteries and stuff, basically fixing stuff around the house that needed fixing. So I think we're good for a few more months. But yeah, everything that the kids needed, setting up iCloud crapola and all that stuff, that's been the last week, which has been good. It's been relaxing.
Yeah. So why don't we dig into the topic for today? So this is going to be slightly different, and we've covered this a couple times, on other people's podcasts, but I don't know that we've ever done it on our own podcast. And, we're almost 7 years in now. So we wanted to talk a little bit today about creating a tech podcast and kind of give everyone a little bit of, some guidelines to get started, some tools that we've used, some tricks, some tips. And so, Brian, where do we want to kind of start off today?
Yeah. And I think the reason we wanted to do this was a couple things. One, we are in a little bit of a slow season from a technology perspective. There isn't usually a lot of announcements made in January, and people are kind of getting back into their year, and they're starting to, figure out where they're going to spend all that budget. But the second thing is, I think we've gotten more and more we've heard from people who say, I'm thinking of starting a podcast, or, we've been on other people's podcast, or even, hey, my company now wants us to do a podcast. So this may be something that you do in your regular job as opposed to your day job. So we thought, okay, we've been doing this. This is now going to go into our 8th year. Why don't we basically open the kimono and share with you guys everything that we've learned in 7 or 8 years, and put it all out there. And if you can learn something from it, that's cool. So why don't we start with the most basic thing, which is, okay, you think you want to do a podcast. What's your motivation for doing a podcast? I think that's probably the best place to start, as opposed to all the technical details. Why do you want to do this?
Yeah. So I will start with, and people have heard this on our show that have listened a long time. For us personally, this was, not part of the day job. Nope. This was a side thing, and this was our way to both learn and stay on top of the industry. And, it's an area we wanted to get into. So, to be really clear, we weren't the experts here. No. Right. And that I want to be the first clear thing of you don't have to be the expert in the field you want to go into. You just need to have a motivation and a willingness to learn. But that also goes to kind of understanding the markets and understanding the marketing of your podcast. For us, we very much get started with the premise of we want to learn. We're not the experts. We want to get people on that are the experts, and we want to share that knowledge. And for us specifically around emerging tech. That was something that was very interesting to us. And so, what I would say for everyone out there is go look at the market, how many podcasts are out there, or kind of a little bit of who are you competing with. And for us, we kind of thought we found a niche and definitely something to look for. What are kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, like we said a long time ago, we started this basically because we don't live in Silicon Valley, and we felt like we needed some way to be connected to to a community at the time. We thought of it as Silicon Valley. Obviously, the community has morphed, and you can be part of community anywhere these days. But yeah, that was it. I think for us, it was. I mean, we always said, look, if nobody ever listens to the show, but we can still convince guests to come on, we're still going to learn something, and we're going to give the guests the ability to talk about the thing that they're passionate about. So there was kind of a win-win scenario that we had from day one. I think you have to figure out, like, why are you doing this? Are you doing this because your company wants you to do it? In which case, maybe it's a marketing endeavor or something along those lines. Are you doing it because you want to learn? Or, maybe you are an expert in something, and it would be awesome for you to share it, and you feel like talking is a better way of doing it than writing or whiteboarding or making videos. And those are all perfectly good goals and so forth. I think the biggest thing I would say is, in terms of goals, set your goals fairly big, because expect to do this for a while. I mean, maybe you only do it for a year, but expect to do it for a while. Set your goals fairly big, and and then go into it with that one sort of purpose. Like, I'm going to try and do that thing really, really well. And I think if you do that, you'll probably start off down the right path of making something that other people might want to listen to.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into the next topic of the people tend to ask us a kind of common set of questions. One of them is I've got this idea and I want to get started. But the next one is, how much of a commitment is this really?
Yeah.
And there's the recording and the editing aspects of it. There is the scheduling aspects of it. Not everyone has a full grasp of the time commitment involved. And up front in particular, because everything gets more efficient with time. And so, Brian, what would be kind of some of your thoughts on
how much time it takes? And I think this is one of those answers I think we've learned from talking to a lot of people, that it kind of depends, and the it depends stuff really depends on how for lack of a better word, like how sort of anal retentive you are about how perfect the audio has to be. It depends on how flexible your schedule is. It'll depend a little bit on kind of who you know or who you're willing to talk to. For us, I'll just throw this out there, sort of where we are these days. Finding a guest can be anywhere from like 1 or 2 emails to, could be like a dozen emails by the time you try and schedule some things and work around your schedule. The recording of the show typically takes about an hour, right? So we typically say, hey, block out an hour. We're going to record about 30, 35 minutes, 40 minutes. We luck out and we get some back channel conversations that we have with people off the record a lot of times. So, block out an hour-ish. And then the editing thing is where it can take anywhere from 20 or 30 minutes if you don't get too picky about taking out all the ums and ahs and all that kind of stuff, to, when we first got started, I mean, it used to take you like 4 or 5 hours because you were super picky about taking them all out. And our good friend John Troyer finally said, guys, you're going to go crazy trying to take them all out. Don't worry about it. Make the conversation sound natural.
Yeah, absolutely. And the publishing aspect of it also can't be, under considered. And the reason why I say that is because it's not just, hey, upload it to your podcast feed. It is, put it on Twitter. It is put it on LinkedIn. It is put it in, Facebook and Google groups and all these other places where the indexing and searching engines can pick everything up. And having a clear publishing pipeline is actually probably the one thing actually we probably still struggle with. I feel like the scheduling is just the scheduling. I actually say the scheduling probably takes almost 50% of our time sometimes.
Yep.
And then of course there's researching and writing show notes, which I would say would be second. But then having that efficient editing and publishing pipeline is something you want to nail down early, because that's something you're going to be doing over and over and over. I mean, this is show 328. So this is something we've been improving on over the last 328 shows, and we continue to do that.
Right. And one thing I'll throw out to folks who are listening to this, if you look in the show notes, I put a couple of links to some Google documents, and they're copies of some things that we use. One of them is basically our flow. Everything from like, how do we record? what tools do we use? How do we edit stuff? Where do we publish things? By no means is it sort of a perfect blueprint, but it will give you a sense of like, okay, what are all the steps I need to think of? There's some things in there that Aaron has put in there about how to automate some of it, where you can save some time and so forth. So there's a link to that in the show notes, and there's also a copy example of kind of how we map out the show notes. So we always tell people that the show isn't scripted, but you will find that as you're doing a show, if you've done your research on the guest, the topic, whatever it is, and if at least you've written down some notes that are kind of in order or logical, you'll keep the conversation tight. And quite honestly, one of the biggest things we've learned about the show is, don't go too long. People only give you so much of their precious time, and usually 30 minutes is sort of a sweet spot. If you want to be less than 30 minutes, that's fine. But if you don't, and we've been on people's show, and no offense to other people, but like if you don't have your questions written down, you kind of don't have your act together. Like taking up 2 hours of your guest time and then starting over and stopping and starting is not a very pleasant experience for them, and you want to make them want to feel comfortable.
Yeah. So let's kind of move into the getting started part. Of course, we have the documents, and I'd say everyone go look at those. But what are some of let's go into the nitty-gritty details, which I don't know that we've ever done too much on this show.
Right.
What are some of like the tools and some of the actual behind the scenes process that we tend to go through?
Yeah. So there's really, so the first thing to understand is, starting a podcast, running a podcast, not very expensive. There's a couple of really big things that you want to get right early on. And then once you get those things right, things sort of flow along. So the first thing we would say is, if your audio quality is bad, nobody will listen. There are too many other good shows out there. So, make an investment in a good microphone. It's going to cost you, maybe $200. We put a link to some recommendations on a bunch of good microphones. So, let's say you're in for a couple $100. The next thing you want to do is you want to find somebody who's going to be a good sort of partner in terms of being an aggregator for you, publishing the show for you. We use a company called Buzzsprout. We've used them since day one. They were one of the few that were out there at the time. There's a bunch of others that are out there now. But you want a partner who, is reliable, will syndicate your show. That's a really important thing. And then the last one is, invest in a couple of tools. There's a lot of free stuff out there, a lot of open source stuff, but you basically want a good recording tool and one or two good editing tools. And those will, take decent audio quality and make them sound really, really good. So those, again, are in the show notes. But those are the basic cost. And then, you want to go into a few, what are the other sort of monthly costs that you tend to run into?
Yeah, well, so what's interesting is some people will, I'll actually be contrarian slightly, in that there's a lot of folks out there that, will have a really, really nice website and web hosting and all of that. And if you go look at our website, and it's been a running joke, but I'm going to bring it up yet again, our website is a free website. It's a blogger website. We don't pay anything for our hosting. And that's one of the reasons why we've never gone off of it, because it meets the needs. For us, it's more about, especially these days as everything's going more and more mobile, that the website isn't a integral part of the podcast experience. So I would say, don't stress about the website, first of all. But there's web hosting, there's podcast hosting. If you look at tools like, say, Zencastr that's out there that we're considering potentially for going to as a future recording platform, there's a monthly cost for Zencastrs. But it's basically what is your basic hosting costs, and then your one-time hardware and software costs, and that's really it.
Right.
And so for us, it's been really, and then we tend to use Audacity and a lot of free tools that are out there for the actual editing themselves. So it's, I would say the biggest investment for people is definitely time.
Yeah.
It is how much of a commitment you want to do, and you don't, they even have a term for it, pod fading. You don't do 10 episodes and quit. That's probably the biggest thing, is get the first 10 to 20 out, and get in the habit of it.
Right. Yeah. The other thing I'll say is as you're selecting tools and so forth, think of it as two things, and we'll get into the format and how many people are on your show and all that stuff. But like, number one, think about using tools that are going to be collaboration friendly, right? So like we use Google Docs and a bunch of stuff, things that allow us to be like, it'll just work on any device. I can share it with anybody. I don't have to worry about a lot of logins to stuff. So, keep that in mind, because you're going to want to share things either with your partner or with your guests or people that are, reaching out to you. And the second thing is, as you're thinking about the tools, think about the fact that as you're recording, you may not always get the guest the way you want to. So you want to be able to do things like, if the guest doesn't have Skype, can I just call their cell phone? Can I call into a bridge? Do I have a way of, connecting your tool to an external tool? Because, you want to make it as easy for the guest as possible, in order, because you may record during the day, you may record at night, they might be calling in from their cell phone. So just, think about flexibility as you're starting to pick your tools.
Yeah. Yep,
so the next one I had on the list, and this is probably one of the biggest areas that people ask us questions about all the time, is, okay, so I got some tools. I think I want to do this. I'm motivated, right? Like I had a brilliant idea. What are the hard parts? Like, what you guys have been doing this for 7 or 8 years. Like, what are the things that you can tell me that's going to save me from skinning my knee and getting a bunch of scars? Like, what are the hard parts of podcasting?
Scheduling. That is, I think, been our biggest constant challenge, whether it's been just even getting the two of us on the same time slot versus a guest, trying to organize a minimum of 3 schedules tends to be the hardest part. And that is why you've noticed one thing, at least we decided early on, is we made all of our workflow, the tools, everything we're doing, everything's written down, everything's documented. And why did we do that? We did that so that Brian and I are interchangeable, and there is no, Brian has to be there because he has to record, or Brian has to be there because he has to publish, or Aaron has to be there because he does the show notes. Like, we are completely interchangeable and optional. As long as there's one of us here. And even we've run shows with guest hosts before where we've given them the same, these same things we're putting out today. We've given them and said, look, here's kind of what we do. Here's the format. Go run with it and just give us the MP3 back.
Right.
So I would say consider that, first of all, because that just makes the scheduling 10 times easier, because you're removing some constraints from the system when you do something like that. So that's number one. The next one I would say is
one little thing on scheduling. Scheduling is, like you said, scheduling is the hardest thing. The one thing we learned, and we've varied from this somewhat, but one thing we've learned and we've tried to stick to is, instead of trying to play calendar roulette, maybe one of the best things you can do is say, here's what time the show always records at. And that's what you can send out to your guests, right? And you can say, look, we always record Tuesday night, 8:00, Eastern time or something. And, can you make it that time? As opposed to trying to schedule around 5 different calendars and somebody's executive admin and all this sort of stuff. Like, sometimes that's a good starting way to do it until you get to a point where you're like, yeah, I have a whole bunch of guests piled up and I can do whatever I want to. But that's just one little trick that we learned is pick a time and then, force everybody to work around that time.
Yeah. And the other one I would say is consistency. And again, we learned our way into this one over time of we originally had the idea of that this was going to be a weekly show. And then, you'll go back and you'll see sometimes we're weekly, sometimes we're not. Sometimes we skipped a few weeks. Sometimes we did more than one in 1 week. And we kind of realized over time, though, while that is easiest for us, again, the commitment aspect of all of this, folks want a regular podcast at a regular time. That leads to the most subscriptions and the most listens over time. And so, for us, we tend to publish by Friday mornings in time for the weekend. And that works for us, but we found it works for our listeners as well. But, having the consistency of every Friday, when somebody pulls up their podcast app, there's a new episode. that helps with subscriptions more than anything.
Right. Yeah, we learned that sort of the hard way. I think we learned, we struggled early on just because we didn't know enough guests, and so we couldn't get a show out every week. We eventually started doing shows at events, and we thought, oh, this will be great. We'll do 10 shows, and we did that a number of times. One of the things we learned was we would dump all 10 shows at the same time, and like half the shows would never get listened to because they wouldn't fit in the podcast player. Somebody would only download 3 or 4, or people would be like, I'm sick of listening about that topic. Like, I don't want to hear any more about OpenStack or about whatever it is. So even if you record a couple at a time, you want to figure out how to space them out. But then you also want to realize that people like variety. They don't want to hear, even if it's 10 variations on the same topic, they don't really want to hear all that. So, again, it goes back to, that's why we don't do very many shows at shows anymore, and we limit them. But scheduling is everything. It's the one thing we've learned. People will binge watch Netflix, but they don't really like to binge listen podcast. Even though sometimes you'll hear people say, "Oh, I went on a plane and listened to 3 or 4 of them." I don't think they want to listen to 10 of them. That's the data that we've seen.
Yeah. And the other thing I would just add to that, so, our guidelines tend to be publish weekly. But I would also say publish weekly at a minimum, but don't publish more than 2 in a week.
Right.
And it goes to that topic of, we kind of did the stats, and as we went through all the different shows and we played with how to kind of trickle them out of, do we do 2 a week? Do we do 3 a week? Do we dump them all in the feed? To maximize the amount of listens, we found, 1 a week at a minimum, 2 a week at a maximum.
Right.
To kind of be the sweet spot. So that's just something we've learned into over the years as well, and we're kind of giving out as guidance.
Yeah, there's 2 other things I'll say will fall into the things that are hard category, right? The first one is, and this is just the reality of it, and honestly, I don't know that we're any better at it now, but if you are hosting the show, you will suck at it for a while, and just be prepared that, as you're listening to yourself, and a lot of people don't like to listen to themselves, it takes a lot of reps. And we've told a lot of people this that have gotten started. You're going to need almost a full year of doing shows. And maybe that's 20 or 30 shows, or maybe it's 50 shows, or whatever it is. But it takes a while to get used to asking questions, feeling comfortable asking questions, hearing the answers from people, whether that's your co-host or yourself, and then learning how to play off of those things. So don't get down on yourself if you feel like, man, the first couple shows just sucked. I sounded terrible. I didn't like how I sounded. The reality is everybody sucks at podcasting or anything that you're doing net new that's a media thing when you first get started. Just keep plowing through it. You need a bunch of reps. I would say anywhere from 20 to 30 shows, and then you'll start to figure out what the right pace and sort of tempo that you need to at least sound respectable.
Yep, agreed. What's next on our list?
Well, I don't have this one. I don't have this one on our list, but I ought to throw this out there. Well, I do have it at the end, but let me throw out at the beginning of it here. People will say, okay, cool, I'm going to spend some time on this. Time is money. Either how much money should I make, or, how do I convince my spouse or whatever this is worth the time to do it? Give people the bare bones of just how much money in groupies and tour buses and all the perks that go along with podcasting. Let's talk about the fame and fortune of this real quick.
Yes. So we get to have, we call it the Cloudcast Christmas party. We take our wives to dinner around this time every year.
Yeah, there is no money. Let me just put it this way: regardless of if you see people say they have sponsors or they do Patreon or whatever, there's no money in podcasting. You will not make out unless you do it as your full-time job. You're Adam Carolla or Mark Maron or Joe Rogan or the Pod Save America people. There's no money in this. So think of it as purely a hobby. If you break even, that's awesome. And you will have to convince your spouse that the hour or 2 hours a week that you're spending or whatever you're spending is basically like career development. That's the way to think about it. Don't get into this thing because you're trying to make any money whatsoever. You will meet a lot of people. You might get invited to events and get some free tickets, but there ain't no money in the banana hammock, as they say.
Yep. So where do we want to go next?
So why don't we?
You want to go in the?
This is your sort of favorite area. Why don't we talk a little bit about the basics of recording, publishing, editing, so that the thing that comes out is somewhat professional looking.
Yeah. So think of it this way. I'll kind of do it in the order in which we actually do all of this. So we record. We actually go. I forget the name of the actual products, but the company is Rogue Amoeba. Both Brian and I are Mac folks, and so Rogue Amoeba makes a really good product line of how do you it's hijacking software. How do you hijack Skype? And so we use Skype. We record all of that actually in high quality
AIFF.
It's basically AIFF. It's basically CD quality recording, and I'll tell you why we do that in a second. So we do that, and we basically hit record. We talk. We do our thing. Then we will take it from there. We'll put it into Audacity. We'll do editing in Audacity, and editing is where we'll chop off the mistakes or Skype drops or any of those other things. Then you get the raw file. Well, what we actually do, and you kind of have to search for it at this point, but there is a tool out there. The company went out of business. It was a podcast network a long time ago, but it's called Levelator. It was like the Conversations Network or something like that. But anyway, you can find the download out there. But it only takes WAV or AIFF files as input. That's why we record it in AIFF. And what it does, it basically normalizes the levels of the guests as well as you, so that you have one nice even volume level. And that was we didn't do this for a long time, and we got a lot of complaints of like, we're super loud and our guest on Skype is super soft. And that was just a nature of the recording formats. And so Levelator was and still is kind of this magical tool to fix everything. So Go find Levelator. I would say if you do nothing else for your sound quality, run everything through Levelator. So that becomes, and then once we have it through Levelator, then we throw it back into Audacity and we put in our intro and outro. And, if we have sponsors, we'll put our sponsors in there. And so this is, basically all the magic kind of tends to happen in Audacity. And then from there, we actually use another tool for the MP3 tags, which is another Rogue Amoeba product called Fission. And that's where we do the podcast art and all of that. And then we kind of kick it out and we throw it in Dropbox so that, we have an archive of it all and we upload it. And the show notes we do in Google Docs, the actual publishing of the files themselves, we use through Blogger. I don't know. Is there anything else?
Yeah. And then again, we use that tool Buzzsprout, which is sort of our publishing tool. And it makes sure that stuff goes out to iTunes and Google Play and Stitcher and basically gives out an RSS feed that the world can pick up on. And I think the one thing to take away from that is people might be sitting here listening to that going, good. That sounds like a ton of work and a lot of tools. And, I don't want to keep up with all that stuff. Like, isn't there like a SaaS service that does all this for us? And the reality is, there are. We've never used one, mostly because we're a little bit old school and we've tried some things a little bit. And unfortunately, some of these services go out of business. And so I think the thing I would say is, kind of like anything else in life, sort of like know the basics of how you would do it if you didn't have the SaaS service. And then, if you're really just like, I don't want to deal with any of that stuff, play around with a few of them, make some sample recordings, play around with a few of them. They will typically cost you, I don't know, $10 a month, $12 a month. And that very well may be worth your time and money to say, look, I just don't want to deal with any of that stuff. I just want to send them a file. They'll clean it up. They'll put the music on it. Or, they might even do some cool things like transcribing it or transcoding it or whatever. But yeah, that's the basics of kind of, the nuts and bolts of how we record and how we publish. And if you want to,
and let me just add this, that entire workflow I just described, you and I have down to what, 15, 20 minutes?
Yeah.
It's a lot of steps, and we actually have a document that we go through step by step here. Do this, put it in this tool, put it in this, do this. But we've done it so many times that if the efficiency of it used to be an hour and a half. Now it's like 20 minutes tops, right? Because we just pull up this tool, run it through there, put it in here. And so like you were saying earlier, I think one of the main reasons we've never gone to one of the new podcasting services is because we completely understand our tool chain it works, and it's extremely fast and efficient at this point.
Yep. And again, it's in the show notes. If you guys want to steal what we did, feel free to borrow it. And if you have suggestions, feel free to send us some suggestions. If you start doing some stuff and you're like, hey, this is, I looked at your steps 3 through 6, and this one thing can combine all those into one. We'd love to hear that. So, listen, we're running kind of pretty close to the end. What I guess the last thing we always get a question of is, okay, you guys do this. You obviously have day jobs. You've bounced around at different jobs and so forth. Like, how do you manage the, not just the, time between your day job and the other job? I mean, we have the potential a lot to have conflicts of interest. You work for a storage company, I work for a software company, and, sometimes we have guests that people might say, well, are they competitive to what you do? Like, how do we manage the potential conflicts at our jobs or conflicts of interest or anything along those lines?
Well, the number one rule is you don't shit where you eat. No,
exactly. That's right. Don't get yourself fired. Exactly.
That's the easy way to put this. The longer answer to all of this, though, is, at least for me personally, we've been doing this long enough that if any job I've come into, because I've been through a number of jobs since we've done this podcast, it's a requirement for me doing the job up front. I check with them up front. Is this a problem? And, is it cool that I'm doing this? And the answer has always been no, this is fantastic. It allows you to stay sharp and stay on top of the industry. And that's exactly what we need. And so I've never personally had any pushback on it. Now, we've also been very smart on it, though, in that we intentionally don't have blatantly have our employers on the podcast. We don't blatantly have major competitors to our day jobs on the podcast. So there is a certain amount of, dancing around topics that we do at times. But, again, it goes back to the amount of money you make off of this. This is a side hobby that is career development to stay on top of the industry. This is not paying the mortgage.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. The other thing I'll throw out there is, and I've run into this with a few jobs, and, occasionally somebody will go, hey, I listened to your show, and, why did you talk to so-and-so or so? Sometimes you got to remember that, learning about this stuff, if you think about it in the context of your day job, can be looked at as, I don't want to call it sort of, competitive intelligence. Like, you're not getting anything that's probably not out in the public domain. Like, nobody's going to tell you any secrets. But sometimes, just talking about it and forcing yourself to do some homework to learn about something that, your competitor might be leading you in or is innovating around, is a good opportunity for you to, to get smarter about a space. And if that helps you in your day job, that can be a useful thing. And quite honestly, like, people that come on the show aren't dummies. If they perceive that we're going to, treat them unfairly or make them look bad or whatever, like they're not going to come on the show either. So it does have a sort of a natural balance to it that, hasn't, like you said, hasn't really been too big of a problem, but we do get a lot of questions sometimes from like PR agencies who go like, hey, would it be okay if my guest comes on, even though you guys in your day job do something else? And, we try and be very transparent with them, right? Like, our job is to educate, at least in this context, for Cloudcast. And, we'll talk about stuff that, again, is out in the public domain. We don't want to make commercials. If we were making commercials for 30 minutes, nobody would listen. So we've always tried to walk around that as finely as we can. Like you said, the number one goal is don't get fired and have the regular paycheck not show up.
Yeah. And the last thing I wanted to cover, because we put it in the links, but we didn't necessarily call that out as a topic. What are some of the production aspects of it? Like, how do you, so we have a voiceover. Yep. We have music that we've purchased as our intro and outro music. We've put those links in the show notes, but I would say, the biggest thing to do is it is not expensive to get professional voiceover or to go purchase music. If you go look at the links, Fiverr is the main link we use. And there's this one lady in particular that we've been using for years for our voiceovers. It's $5. Yeah. Plus a commercial use license, which is, I don't know, like an additional 20, right, something like that. And then the purchase music was like, I forget, it was like $50 for the song or something like, I don't even remember exactly, but the don't be intimidated, at being able to go out and get these services. They're out there. There's links in the show notes, and they're relatively inexpensive.
Right. And don't do something dumb like, you love Rage Against the Machine, so you're going to use that as your music, and you forget that you're not allowed to, sort of publicly use less than 10 seconds or something. Like, don't do something dumb and reuse somebody's licensed music, and then somehow you get a phone call from somebody that says, hey, you either got to take all your shows down or you owe us a bunch of money, or there's plenty of stuff that's either really cheap or free license-free stuff for music. Use something like that. Don't get yourself in trouble. Don't do something dumb just because you're like, oh, I love this song, or it reminds me of something from my high school days or something.
Right, exactly.
Well, listen, man, I think we covered a lot, and for a lot of people that listened to the show, they were like, "Oh, that wasn't technical." But again, we are seeing more and more people that are using podcasts, and I think to a certain extent, you could take the things that we talked about today, and you could apply them just in terms of sort of the preparation, the scheduling, trying to make it sound professional. You could apply that to, hey, I've got to do whiteboards for my job, or even just I have to present for my job, and how do I make sure I'm prepared? So hopefully, some of the tips and tricks that we gave you will be helpful, in whatever endeavor you might use them. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot us an email, shoot us a Twitter. We're happy to share some of this stuff. And, like we said, we've been doing it for 8 years. So if nothing else, we have lots of scrapes and scars and battle wounds and stuff to share if anybody's interested in learning about it. Well, listen, awesome. Man, why don't we wrap it up? Why don't you take us home, and we will look forward to a great 2018 with everybody this year.
Yep. So the one final bit, we didn't talk about it at the top of the show, but, if you're interested, we are still raising money for the North Carolina Children's Home through the Krispy Kreme Challenge, the crazy donut race Brian and I do every year. Donations are looking really good. But if you would like to go to our webpage at thecloudcast.net, the link is in the top right-hand corner on that. Just click on that, and we would love to do, if you would do a donation for the North Carolina Children's Home, all of the proceeds go to them. So with that, on behalf of Brian and myself, thank you very much for listening this week, and we'll talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more podcasts, show notes, and everything social media. And visit acloud.guru for all your cloud training needs.